right after I talked with you on the phone, when we canceled that last appointment,
Yeah.
I got on a plane and I flew. It was a Sunday night to Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
And I said, what's the best restaurant? And they sent me to a place named Henrichi's. And there was a picture of Marion Marlowe on the wall as I was eating dinner, and I thought, gee, I wish I were a celebrity so they could ask me to sign an 8x10 glossy so I could tell them what I thought of this food.
That was...
Wasn't so good.
That was, I think, because of our opening night show of Man of La Mancha last year was held there.
That's what you were doing there?
Right,
Yeah.
For the Kenny Players.
I didn't think much of Henrichi's.
Yeah, well, it's a rather strained place, I find. I like more informal digs to eat.
Well, I don't eat meat, so I'm rather restricted.
Well, I was a vegetarian until I was about 22, and I must say I'm getting back to it now. I eat very little meat, and then it's fish or fowl.
Yeah.
Sometimes lamb.
Listen, the first I heard of Marion Marlowe, or saw Marion Marlowe, was on Arthur Godfrey's show. Was that the first
I think that's the first time anybody ever did, at least in America.
Did he sort of find you?
Oh, he didn't sort of. He did.
How did he find you?
Oh, Lord, that's such an old story. Okay. I had a one-night stand at the Kenilworth Hotel in Florida. One-night stand, for those who don't know it, means I sang 5 songs and I got $35, which paid the rent, which tells you how far back this was. It was January the 9th, 1951, to be exact. And he happened to be in the audience. I didn't know who Arthur Godfrey was because I'd been in England for the last 8 months doing a show, and I'd never seen television. And after the show was over, this redhead came back and said, would you like to come to New York and be on my television show? And, of course, I thought he was, crazy. And the owner of the hotel said, no, he really has a television show. And he said, I'll give you $100 if you'll come. Well, that's all he had to say. And I was at the airport the next morning, and that's how it started.
Was that the Talent Scout show?
No, that was not the Talent Scout show. I was never on the Talent Scout show. I was put directly on the Wednesday night show. And I did the whole thing completely blank. I don't remember a single minute of it. I was so scared. And then I flew back to Florida, and then 2 weeks later he called and said that the mail was so good, would I come back and do it again? To make a long story short, I commuted for about 5 months between New York and Miami, because I was living there, and then signed a contract to be on his show regularly on the morning show as well as the Wednesday night show, and I was on it for 5.5 years.
The first time you sang, was it with Frank Parker?
No, the first time I sang alone. I did Summertime in Granada. And Frank and I actually were thrown together on a Wednesday night show purely as an accident. The show was not timed correctly, and we had like 2 minutes left. And, of course, this is when we were talking about live radio, which is so great, and live television, when you don't just, slip something in on tape. And so Arthur says, well, what the heck can we do? And we were on television, when he said it. And he said, Frank, why don't you sing something, Well, we put together, and let's see, what was the first one we did? Isn't that funny? It slipped my mind.
Sweetheart.
I don't even remember what it was. No, it wasn't that corny. It was something I had to know the lyrics to. Take Me in Your Arms. That's what it was. And it was seemed to be a big hit, and so we were sort of stuck with each other for the next 5 years.
I always thought it was peculiar that a lot of people who know Frank Parker from that show didn't know that he was a big name years before.
Well, I didn't know it because I think it was during the early days of Jack Benny radio that he was a tremendous star in radio. And that was a little bit before my time, not much, but it was before my time, and he was his record of Begin the Beguine sold something like 5 million copies, when at that point there were like 5 million phonograph players in the United States. He was a fantastic star.
Yeah, he was right up there with Lanny Ross and Arthur Tracy. And
he was a fantastic big name.
He's a strange man. Do you see him anymore?
Frank? I saw Frank when I came back to New York. Oh, I guess it's now about 6 months ago. He looks exactly the same. We had dinner together. He looks exactly the same. He's gained maybe 5 pounds. And he doesn't sing anymore, but he's taken up painting, and he paints absolutely beautifully. And he never painted before in his life. And yet every place I go, people always, no matter what I've ever done since the Godfrey show, they always talk about Frank.
Well, I got his telephone number. No, I got his address, I guess it was. And I wrote him a letter and asked him if I could interview him.
Right.
And he called me up and he said he didn't want to be interviewed because he had no interest whatever in the business anymore.
He really doesn't.
He says he will never sing again.
No, he won't.
Well, do you know what happened? He wouldn't tell me.
Well, I don't think it was any one thing that ever makes anybody give up a business. I think it's a lot of things together. Frank has moved into a different era of his life now. Frank is older. Frank, I guess he's never enjoyed the grind of it. Let's face it, it's a grind, this business. It's taxing, it's chaotic, and I guess he wants to relax and enjoy life a little. I'm all for it.
Yeah, I am too. I just
think
wanted to interview him.
Well, maybe we can get him, because I think an awful lot of people would be interested in talking to him. He's a very interesting man.
Do you see many of the people you worked with on that show?
No, I don't. I suppose since I've been off the show, I've bumped into all of them, if not here in Canada or in Las Vegas. Julie, of course, Julius Rosa, I bumped into several times. We were competition playing in different towns. You know, we usually meet at airports at ridiculous hours or at late-night eating places. The McGuire sisters, naturally, in Vegas. Luann Sims I haven't seen. The Cardettes have since disbanded, of course. One of them is now Mrs. Archie Blyer, as you know. And I believe the Mariners have disbanded. But I did bump into, it's very funny, one of them. I was going up an escalator, and he was going down an escalator in the bus terminal. We both saw each other, and we said, hey! Then I got on the down, and he went up. It took us about 3 trips before we got together, and they've disbanded at the moment. But
how about Holly Loki?
Holly Loki Kaulapua, she is now with Orchids of Hawaii, and I think has been in Hawaii or back in the islands for quite a few years.
What sort of, how do I want to phrase this question? That program, the Arthur Godfrey Show, both of them, I think, were very intriguing to me because there was so much controversy about them, and yet on the air there was a nice family feeling to the whole thing. Yes, there really was.
I think the controversy, basically, at least during the beginning of the show when I was on it, the first several years, was made controversy because it was of interest to the public. The first little while I was on the show, I had a ball. First of all, I was making a living. I could send for my family. I had a steady job. People knew my face. When you're 18 years old, this is a big thing to happen to you, you know. And I was very happy. And I met and married the man that I loved on the show, who produced the Talent Scout show and the Wednesday night show. He's since passed away a year and a half ago, but we had 14 years of very happy marriage. I think people like to pick on people who were in the limelight, that's all.
After 5.5 years, then, why did you leave?
I was fired.
Oh. Tell all.
Sure. Well, I mean, everybody knows that. That's part of public record.
Was it as dramatic as Julius LaRosa's?
I would say so, because I sure didn't expect it. It wasn't on the air, but I received my engagement ring on Wednesday, and Arthur noticed it on the Wednesday night show and asked me to show it on camera. And Friday morning, myself and the Mariners were called into his office and were given the pink slip, read a thing, that said, "This is it. I'm changing the format. Your services will no longer be required." And that was it.
Do you ever see Arthur Godfrey anymore?
I have never seen him from that moment on, and it's amazing that we haven't met by accident, It's been a lot of years, and we've been many of the same places. We just never have bumped into each other.
Did your husband continue as his producer after?
For about another 6 months, and then he was fired.
What was it like when Julius LaRosa was fired? Because I worked at CBS, and I worked in the teletype room, and all at once this came across the wire, and they said, turn on the radio.
Nobody believed it, including all of us on the show. I mean, it was like the axe fell. What can I tell you? I can't compare it to anything that happened other than the fact that when the day that the axe fell on me, And, but we just couldn't believe it. And, of course, it took everything else off the front pages. Everything in the world was unimportant. All that was important was one singer. And what one man did with the program, which is kind of silly, which showed there wasn't really that much news doing that day. Because what happens to one person's life is really not that important in the time I think that we live. It's what happens to everybody's life that's important. But Julie certainly didn't know it was going to happen any more than I did.
How did he take it?
Like a man. He is a man. Julie's a fine boy.
Yes, I remember...
He's a man now, but he was a fine young man then.
As I recall, Godfrey said something about, you have just heard...
His
Julius LaRosa's swan
That's
song,
right.
He had lost his humility.
Mm-hmm. I think that was like that. I know the swan song was correct, and it was something about humility. I don't remember. I didn't record it for posterity at that point. I've been asked to record things like that many, many times, but I feel like the past is past, and I'm more interested in my future than my past.
I think he found Julius LaRose at a Navy entertainment show?
I think so, because I know Julia had just gotten out of service and came on the show, and he was still in uniform, I think, the first time I saw him. And then, of course, he had the big hit with E Compare, you know. And he had a big, open, wonderful face, and he was just himself. He didn't know how to be anything else, and that was his charm.
Yeah. Were you with the show when they had The Great Man, when that book came out?
No, that was after I left the show.
Did you read it?
Of course.
What'd you think?
It all sounded very familiar.
It did. What was Godfrey like to work with?
Well, I guess he was like anybody else. He had his good days and his bad days. He could be the most charming man in the world. And then he could be the least charming man in the world. I really have nothing more to say about him. It's so long ago.
You know, I had lived in a rooming house at the time you were really at the height with on the Godfrey show, and my landlady used to sit in front of that set. She never missed that show.
Yeah.
And she was so intrigued with, she thought, your romance with Frank Parker.
Oh, listen, everyone. When I finally told my mother I was going to be married to Larry, the first thing she said was, "What will Frank say?" I said, "Mama, will you please stop?" I said, "I've never even been out with Frank." And I hadn't. We had never dated. Never even dated. And we both resented this so much. We didn't mind it on camera, you know, but we each had our own personal lives. And we got so that we would almost be mad at each other because everyone was pushing us together. We didn't want to be pushed together, you know. It was very funny.
Well, my landlady was outraged about it, I think, in a way, because she always said to me, "You know, he's much too old for that girl."
Well, it's interesting because the man I married was Frank's age. And we were very happily married, though he was much older than I. We had a very happy marriage. I don't think age has that much to do with happiness.
Did they ever tell you to pretend that you were infatuated with him?
I had enough common sense. I've been in the business since I was 14, and I know that when you're singing a love song, you're certainly not supposed to look like you hate the guy.
Well, you didn't. You haven't seen him but once in a long time.
Frank, yes. I saw him, well, you know, I've been living in San Francisco for several years, and then after my husband died, I came back into New York, and about 6 or 8 months later, Frank had written a very beautiful letter because he and Larry had been friends for 25 years before I ever met Frank. And they'd been almost boyhood friends, and Larry had managed him during his Jack Benny career. And he wrote a very beautiful letter, and I called him to thank him for it, and we had dinner. That's all.
Where did you go after you departed the Godfrey cast?
Well, I was signed exclusively, as a matter of fact, about 25 minutes after I was fired by Ed Sullivan for 2 years, and that I could appear on his show only for 2 years for an awful lot of money, for which I was extremely grateful. And then when I wasn't in New York taping his shows, I played, you name it, all the major spots in the United States and Canada, all the big hotels and the big clubs, the Las Vegas and Miami and Copacabana and Pierre and, you know, all the places that you normally do if you get fired off of a big show with a lot of publicity.
Come to think of it, he did the same thing for Julius LaRosa.
Of course. We were both fired into a lot of money. So, I mean, yeah, I don't think you can be angry about that. It took me personally a long time to get over it because I'm sort of the sensitive type. But I can say I'm now completely over it. It doesn't bother me a bit.
Do people still come up to you on the street because you look exactly like Marion Marlowe and
nice
ask you about Godfrey?
It's been a long time. But yes, people still do. If they do recognize me, they say, "Have you seen Arthur lately? And how is Frank?" It's amazing. It's amazing. You know, there's nothing more dead, really, than yesterday's news. We all know that. And yet this has happened how long ago?
Well,
1956.
Mm-hmm.
This is 1971. People still remember it, which shows that at that time there were like 40 million people looking at television. And on Wednesday night, they always watched the show because we had 40 million people watching us. So I gained, by being on that show at that time, visibility that if I'd lived to be 500 years old and performed every day on Broadway, I could never have played before that many people. So it's amazing how many people still remember.
Marion Marlowe and I were talking before we began recording about the difference between taping, which is what we're doing now, or doing it live.
Right.
I don't know if we could tell an audience the difference. I don't know if I could.
Well, I guess spontaneity is the only word I can think of, and that is only a second best. It's a word that, words. You're hung up in words. It's a feeling more than anything else. I think there's an electricity that happens between people if they're performing in front of a live audience. Or, for instance, I'm not thinking of this as a taping. To me, we're doing this live. Many of the things that are taped are so cut and dried. You look at a show on television, you can tell when they come in with the laughter, and I don't even watch it because it's dull. I like the talk shows. I like things that are done live.
Very few of the talk shows
very few are done now.
Are done spontaneously.
Right. Well, I think a great deal of that has to do, the blame falls a great deal of this, I think, on the performers who have gone on the talk shows and tried to say something that would be shocking, that would get them publicity. So I don't believe this is as much the fault of the stations as it is the performers.
Well,
I think they've hung themselves on that.
Another thing that a lot of people don't understand, in fact, I don't think anybody understands it unless they're in the business, is that on these talk shows, the big ones,
right.
the Merv Griffin and
right.
Tonight Show and so forth,
right.
you are pre-interviewed.
Of course.
And I used to wonder, well, why are you pre-interviewed? And then I was pre-interviewed once, and I realized why. It was really to make sure that you don't say anything that they really don't want to hear.
Exactly.
Not that it's off color. They're just things that they don't want to hear.
That's right. And there's certain mail that they don't want to get things on, and if they know you're not going to talk on that, then you can be on the shows. Which, of course, is like monitored radio, which is not really free radio, which is not free television. People should be able to speak their own thoughts, and of course we can within the bounds of the FCC, which in itself is a good organization, and I understand why it exists. But I do believe that we are coming to a time when everyone wants to know more, wants to be exposed to more opinions than just one or two or three. I think everyone in this country is getting to that stage. I certainly am.
I was interviewed, about 2 years ago, I think, for The Tonight Show, and one of the questions the man asked me, it was an associate producer, was why, he said, why do you interview so many people like silent stars and people from the early talkies? And I said, everybody who interviews me asks me that. There really isn't any answer to it. And he said, he kept pressing it.
Yes.
So I thought, well, okay. So I said, well, all right, I'll answer that for you, but I don't think you want to hear it. And he said, well, why don't you answer it anyway? And I said, okay. I said, the main reason is that I used to live in Hollywood, and I worked in New York in the PR offices, and I saw the way these people were treated. It's very much like lepers are treated in India.
That's correct.
And there was he blanched beneath his bragi, and there was a sharp intake
beautiful.
of breath. And as it happened, the show was moving to the coast for a few weeks, and they would let me know. And I knew I blew it, and I thought, to hell with it. I really don't care. I've got to say this.
That's why you're you, and that's why you're doing what you're doing and the kind of interviews you're doing. Because I think everybody's tired of that kind of phony radio and phony stuff.
Well, I think there's another thing too, and this is true, I think, of every one of the network talk shows or the big syndicated talk shows, and that is that the host, you correct me if I'm wrong, the host never meets any of the people he's going to interview before you walk out and they say, will you welcome, please?
That's correct. I've never met any of them.
And I've done the Mike Douglas show now 3 times, and I don't get nervous over those things because I think, what does it matter anyway? But I've seen people who were there plugging their first book, or who are not professionals,
Right.
and they're nervous wrecks. And all it would take is for him to walk in their dressing room and say, look, I'm Mike Douglas, and I'm going to ask you a few questions, and none of them are going to be personal. Something.
Right.
But you walk on, you're hit with lights and music.
Well, a lot of people freeze up, of course, which is what happens, and a pro can freeze up. Anytime if you do a Broadway show for 3 years, you walk out and the curtain goes up and you forget your first line. It's happened to the best. So it can certainly happen to someone who's not used to it all the time.
Were there any disasters during your years of live television?
Oh, there are many disasters. None I couldn't walk away from, fortunately. I mean, they all seem so mild and silly now compared to the age we live in. But things like, I remember one morning show, got an awful lot of mail on it. And I remember Arthur wouldn't talk to me for 2 months because he thought sure I had planned it. I was doing, one of those soprano songs that I can't stand with a high note ending. And I have, when I take a breath, I have about a 4-inch expansion through my diaphragm because I've been singing for a long time. And if you're going to hit a high C, you have to have a lot of wind behind it. And so I took a deep breath, and this was during the era of very full skirts, and you wore full petticoats underneath it. And as I did, the big hook that hooked my big crinoline petticoat underneath snapped, and my petticoat fell around my ankles. Now, I had to hold this note for like 12 bars, and the camera crew, being who they were, and as on the ball as they were, cut away to a long shot, and it showed, and the audience they were all dying laughing, and it showed me standing with this petticoat. Good thing we didn't have color television, because I'm sure I turned deep purple. And when it was finished, I stepped out of my petticoat and exited. Just left it there. It doesn't sound like anything now, but it sure was then.
And he was annoyed about it.
He was more than annoyed. He was mad as hell. He felt sure it was planned, and it wasn't. I really never have gone for that kind of publicity. If I did, I'd certainly think up something better than that.
What kind of a feeling was there among the cast, like after the first firing? That must
it shook us all up a great
feeling.
deal. Well, it shook us all up a great deal, as I recall, and I seem to remember that nobody sort of trusted anybody anymore. And the period of time after that was extremely uncomfortable. I would say that from shortly before Julius's firing, because there was, some talk about people dating other people in the cast and that. But from that period of time on, there was not the same family feeling of relaxation that there had been before.
How do you mean talk about people dating other people?
Well, I mean, some of the newspapers said that one of the reasons Julius was fired was because he was dating one of the McGuire sisters. I don't know if this is true or not, but that's what one of the newspapers said.
That was forbidden, to date a McGuire sister?
One just didn't date one on the program.
Really?
Yes.
Were you told that?
No. There are certain things known as intuition.
Uh-huh.
And following your hunches. That's all.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think you find most closed shop shows where there is a tight rein and it's headed up by one person. The father figure does take on the father figure, I mean, ours is not the only show like that. There were several others similar, but ours was the first like it.
Did you make great friends in your years in network TV?
Great friends?
Yeah, close
like
friends
whom?
that you still see? I don't know, anybody that we would know.
Oh, I know a lot of people in show business, but I can't say any of them are close friends. All my close friends are out of show business.
Well, that speaks very well for your value.
I put my value on real people, not on fronts.
Well, there are some in this business, I
there
must
are.
say. They're hard to find.
But I had to grow up within myself before I could see through what was false and what was real. Yes, I've found the last year or so I'm finding some wonderful people in this business. But I didn't in the earlier years. I guess I was looking for the wrong things. But then my values have changed, too. I've grown up a lot.
I think all of ours have,
if
we were lucky.
Have. Yeah. Well, there's only one way. You either grow up or down. You can't stay still.
Well, we've talked enough about the past. Tell us now what you're doing now, where you're living. And
Well, I've moved to New Jersey, and I love it very, very much. I've been
Lodi, New Jersey.
Lodi, New Jersey, right. And I have a small house there and a nice backyard for my dog Sam. My mother lives with me. My friend Nancy Barr, who is a very fine, talented artist, lives with me. We do exciting things like cook and plant tomatoes and have a compost heap in the backyard for our organic farm this summer. And, I just got somebody who said yay. We do exciting things like recycle garbage and shred papers and collect sawdust and pull weeds, plant trees, meet kids. It's a great life. When I'm not on the road, this is what I do. I live when I'm not on the road. When I'm on the road, I work and I perform. But I live when I get home.
I think I've got just about enough time to explore something you mentioned a bit earlier. You said something about the soprano numbers that you hated.
Yes.
Hated.
Yes.
Did you want to do different material for
yes.
Godfrey show?
Oh, of course. I mean, there were many things I would have liked to have done, but I couldn't because I had to be kept in a category. We had, one person for each category. For instance, now I'm getting ready to do the Ethel Merman role in Gypsy, which I've done before and I love. It's one of my favorite roles of all time, but I could never attempt anything like that because it was too much like what Jeanette did, the modern songs. So I'm delighted to have been a soprano. I am still a soprano, but having developed the voice that I had from Man of La Mancha doing Aldonza, I'm delighted now to be able to get out and belt out a couple of songs and do a pratfall.
Did you actually go to Godfrey and tell him you'd like to do something else, or you just knew that he wouldn't?
Yes, no, I asked, but he had, final say-so. It was his program, naturally.
You mentioned Jeanette Davis, you met.
Right.
She's out on Syosset, Long Island.
Yes, that's right.
You hear from her?
No, I've never heard from her, but she and her husband came to see Man of La Mancha when I was doing it down at the amphitheater, and we had a nice reunion.
Well, she gave me a very similar answer to Frank Parker. She said she had no interest at all in discussing her career. She was very happy.
She seems to be very happily married and has two lovely children that she's being a wonderful mother to. And I think if a woman is happily married and happy in her home, she has absolutely no need for a career.
And
if that puts me against women's lib, let me say I am. I think women are awful lucky, and they're darn fools if they don't take advantage of it.
I think anybody who's making love with someone they love on a regular basis has made it.
That's right.
Has made it. They needn't look really
That's true.
Any further. But it was strange, her reaction. She was very pleasant.
Yes.
But she said she had no interest ever again in performing, and she didn't want to discuss her career. And after I hung up, I recall that for a short period of time, she even produced one of the shows. I think it was the Talent Scout show.
I'm not aware of that.
For a short period of time. It was. I remember exactly, as a matter of fact, when it was. It was when the quiz show scandals broke, and everybody was suspect. And, of course, his was a talent show.
What year was this?
Well, when would it have been? I guess late 50s, 57, 58.
Well, perhaps
when
my
21 and the $100,000 question, all that went up in there. And he announced very dramatically, as was his habit at the end of the show, that from now on, he had posted a $10,000 bond, he said, of his own money, and anybody could prove that anybody got on that show or won on the show with anything underhanded would...
Well, I can tell you in all honesty, because when I say this, I'm not defending Arthur Godfrey, I'm defending my late husband, Larry Puck, who produced that show, that as long as he produced it, at any rate, nobody got on that show underhandedly, because my husband was an honorable man, and he never accepted anything from anyone, and Lord knows he was offered the world, and he never accepted it. And certainly during the time that he was on the show, those applause meters were for real. Clacks were kept out of that theater. And as honest as you can be without frisking everybody who comes in, that show was honest.
Who were some of the people who made it from that Talent Scout show?
Oh, my gosh. I couldn't begin to tell you because, first of all, I was never on it. It's been so many years. I think Vic Damone was on it. I think... you've asked me a bad question now, because there's a list a mile long, but I don't remember. You see, I was never affiliated with that show. I went right to the Wednesday show. The McGuire sisters were on it. The Cardettes were on it. The Mariners were on it. Everyone who was on the morning show, with the exception of myself, had been on the Talent Scout show. I was the only one that Godfrey signed. Other than that, Larry signed them all.
Gee, I'm glad I got a chance to meet you. I should say also that this is the first interview the one I'm doing right now with Marion Marlowe, the first interview I've done in our new studios, and they're a delight, and so were you.
They certainly are a delight.
And I'm glad I started out with you because I watched you so many years on television. And
good. Maybe next time we can come back and talk about the future instead of the past.
Yes. Well, if you take out time from your, what is it, rescheduling garbage? What is it you do with garbage? Recycling.
Glass and garbage.
Garbage. I've been talking today with Marion Marlowe. And I want to thank her very much for the interview.
It was my pleasure.
Good. And thank you for listening. This is Richard Lamparski. Have a good evening.